I read 50 books in 2025, finishing my 50th read on New Year's Eve, and these were the absolute best books that I read. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, Eclectic Reads. Today I would like to talk about my 5 favorite fiction novels and my 3 favorite nonfiction books that I read in 2025. They were phenomenal. I'm going to timestamp where I talk about nonfiction books in case you would prefer to just skip directly to the nonfiction reads. So let's start with the fiction. These books are in order from my least favorite to my favorite, but of course, like I said, I would recommend all of these. So my 5th favorite book of 2025 was Murder at Pirates Cove by Josh Lanyon. Josh Lanyon is actually a very well-established queer mystery writer. She writes a lot of mysteries centering on male-male romances, but this was the first in a fairly new cozy mystery series. In this one, our protagonist, and I don't remember his name actually, because I read this book so many months ago, he inherits a bookstore as well as this estate from, I think it's his aunt, and he moves to this small town. He was living in New York City as I think an actor, and he wasn't doing so well. So it's a change of pace for him. But one day he finds someone dead in his bookstore. And because he had just recently opened the bookstore, he is now stigmatized by this. And the person he found dead just so happened to be this real estate mogul in town who likes to buy up a lot of property, and he had offered to buy up the bookstore that wasn't doing very well, but he was turned down, and now he's found dead in this protagonist's bookstore. It was really, really good, not only because of the writing and the character development, but also because of the twist at the end that I did not see coming, and I actually gasped out loud when I read that part. It was definitely a 5-star cozy and the only cozy mystery on this list. My number 4 favorite book of 2025 was The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. This book is set in the aftermath of the Mexican War of Independence. This is a Mexican Gothic novel following Beatriz, who is dealing with the aftermath of this war on her own family. The revolutionaries had won, and her father was seen as a friend to the emperor, and so he was assassinated, and she and her mother lost their entire estate. So, to help herself and her family, Beatriz decides to marry Rodolfo. Now, Rodolfo has been doing very well. His estate has been growing McGee, which is agave, all through the war, and they've done really, really well. He is a hacendado. That is someone who runs the haciendas, these large estates in Mexico. As you can imagine, Beatriz's mother is not a fan because Rodolfo was on the side of the revolutionaries, and so these were the people who assassinated her husband. But Beatriz hopes that if she fixes up this estate, Hacienda San Isidro, she will understand why Beatriz made the decision she made. Except things don't go as planned, and this house is definitely haunted. So Beatriz partners with a very unconventional priest, a priest who practices witchcraft, to try to drive the various spirits from this house. This was at once a haunted house novel and an interesting commentary on the social dynamics of post-independence Mexico. It was brilliant. I was totally invested, and it made me realize that I want to read more Gothic horror novels. I look forward to reading, I think it's called The Possession of Alba Diaz by the same author very soon. Number 3, a book that I read immediately after The Hacienda, but I thought was slightly better, and that's why it has the 3rd spot, was Kindred by Octavia Butler. Kindred is a sci-fi horror novel where the horror is the history. So whereas the hacienda's horror is, in the spirits that are haunting this estate, Kindred's horror is in the lived experience of enslaved people in antebellum Maryland. We are following our protagonist. She is a Black woman between jobs. She's like a struggling writer. She's married to a white man who's actually a pretty successful author. And she is suddenly transported back to antebellum Maryland. She doesn't realize it at the time. She's just trying to save a boy who was drowning. Turns out this boy, Rufus, is the son of an enslaver. And she ends up having to live as an enslaved woman in this plantation. And the horror is the history. It was unrelenting and definitely not a book that you just pick up at a whim. You really have to be prepared for it. And I think that I was at the time to read something like this. What I really liked about the book is that it focuses on the experience of an enslaved woman and like what was that like living on these plantations and having to work on the plantation. It reminds me of what Angela Davis talks about, where when we talk about Black women and Black enslaved women, we have to remember that in some ways they had the same experience as enslaved men because they were forced to be on the fields and pick cotton, and they've dealt with the brutality of the beatings, which are very viscerally described in Kindred. But also, in addition to that, they had to deal with sexual violence. And so that is very much present in this book. Now, if you recall, our protagonist is married to a white man, and he ends up also being transported back, except now he has to pretend to be an enslaver. It is brilliant. And I think that the ending was what the ending needed to be. I look forward to read other things by Octavia Butler in 2026. Number 2 is a book that's probably actually not going to work for everyone, and that's Still Life by Louise Penny. The entire Inspector Armand Gamache series by Louise Penny isn't for everybody because the characters are at times really, really unpleasant, including the protagonists, including the inspectors. And that starts right at the beginning of the series. I've already read 2 books in the series. The first one, Still Life, I gave 5 stars. The second book, Fatal Grace, I gave 3.5 stars. I spoke about this recently in a video in which I discuss something like 11 or 12 Christmassy, wintry books. So you can check that out. I will link it below if you're interested. But this one I gave 5 stars. This is what I would consider a literary mystery. So Armand Gamache is the chief inspector of the Sûreté du Québec in the province of Quebec, and he is investigating the death, which has been seen as an accident, of Jane Nelson. I think that was her name. She was a school teacher. Well, she was a retired school teacher who at the beginning of the story breaks up a homophobic attack on some of her friends. And we also learn that she's finally revealing to the world her art, and her art is getting mixed responses. Armand Gamache, is investigating this murder, well, what we come to realize is a murder, along with a new inspector, Yvette Nicole. I talk extensively about her character in my review of this book, which I will link below. She is messy. She's a very complex character. I would argue that Gamache is as well, and really all the other characters. This town, Three Pines, is very picturesque. It looks perfect on the outside, but it hides a lot of rot. And there's something just very sinister about this town that is exposed in the murder of Jane Nelson. And we see something similar in the second book in the series. I absolutely will be reading other books, but Still Life to me was just not only a great mystery, but also literarily very sophisticated. At the center of the story is a fresco. A Still Life, painted by Jane Nelson, which is very, very controversial. And the mystery very much surrounds this art piece. I really love the way in which this concept of still life was explored. Like I said, I talk about this extensively in my review, which I will link below. And number one, my favorite fiction novel of 2025, really shouldn't have been a surprise to me because I have loved every other book this author has written. Flush by Virginia Woolf. I have read Mrs. Dalloway several times, and it is one of my all-time favorite novels. I've read Orlando once, and I intend to reread it in 2026. Flush, unlike Mrs. Dalloway, which is in Stream of Consciousness, Flush is straightforward. I would say this is actually a great place to begin. This tells the story of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, who had a romance with Robert Browning, eventually eloped with him, married him, but the story is told from the perspective of her Cocker Spaniel, Flush. And whereas humans sense the world primarily through sight, dogs sense the world more through their hearing and through touch. And so we come to understand Elizabeth Barrett's story from that perspective. For many years, I think beginning in her teenage years, she had some kind of a temporary disability that caused her to be an invalid. She was being cared for by her brother, I believe. And so we also see what it's like for women at this time, with their very limited freedoms. And now she has basically no freedom. There are men who are determining her every movement. And this book, like all of Virginia Woolf's books, also deals with gender. This book was perfect. I really need to read all of Virginia Woolf's novels very soon because I don't think she can write a bad book. She left the world way too soon. Her books were incredible. So those are the 5 best fiction novels I read in 2025. Now on to the 3 best nonfiction books that I read. So last summer, I decided to spend a few months learning about Palestine, particularly the Palestinians in Gaza and their history, the history of the apartheid, and just everything about that. And one of the first books that I read was Palestine by Joe Sacco. Actually, I think that might have been the second book that I read on Palestine. Now, Palestine by Joe Sacco is a graphic nonfiction history of the Palestinians, and definitely a good place to start if you don't know anything, like I did, about really what is happening in this region. But my favorite graphic history was Footnotes in Gaza by the same author, Joe Sacco. So this book is, even though it's a graphic novel, it's actually graphic nonfiction, it's a long one. It will definitely take you several hours to read. There's a lot of text. It's very thick. And it focuses primarily on 2 massacres that occurred in the 1950s. One is Khan Yunis and one in Rafah. And this book is about Joe Sacco's journey and trying to figure out exactly what happened, because as you can imagine, Israel has concealed a lot of that information. So he wanted to fill in the holes by talking to people who were witnesses to those massacres. Maybe they had family members who died. And it's a book that also talks about how hard it is to piece together an oral history. I thought it was brilliant. I mean, as somebody whose background is in studying massacres and martyrdoms in 16th century Europe, I am very, very interested in this kind of material. And this book I would recommend to people who really want to not only understand history that has been concealed, but also like the process of trying to understand a time period and like the challenges that historians face. Because here, Joe Sacco is a journalist, but he's also doing the work of a historian. And I thought it was brilliant. It reminded me a lot of L'amour la fantasia by Assia Djebar. I will put the English translation on the screen. That book also deals with a massacre. There is a whole section where Asia Jabar talks about the massacre of the Berbers under the French. And she tries to bring that out of the archive so that people understand what happened at that period, particularly how that impacted women. Anyway, would recommend both books. And this is the reason why Footnotes in Gaza is one of my favorite nonfiction books of 2025. My second favorite nonfiction book of 2025 was Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. This book was infuriating. This is a work of investigative journalism. Patrick Radden Keefe tells the story of the Sackler family, the family behind Purdue Pharma, who produced OxyContin and very aggressively marketed it, and the ways in which this family is responsible largely for the opioid epidemic. At a certain point in the story, I felt like I was reading about the Corleone family. Just like the Corleones have like Tom Hagen to take the fall for the family, we've got something similar in the Sackler family. The story begins with Arthur Sackler, who was the oldest of the Sackler brothers, the other two being Mortimer, middle child, and then Raymond being the youngest. And Raymond is really the one who like runs Purdue Pharma for many, many years. But Arthur already establishes the ethos of the family when he not only is in pharmaceuticals, but he's also in advertising. And it is this combination of advertising and medicine that us Americans know so well that is at the root of this just horror. The things that this family does, and the fact that they've never, and probably never will be, imprisoned is just a testament to the problems in big pharma. It also makes me understand why so many people are suspicious about pharmaceutical companies. I get it, because the FDA was totally complicit in all of this. This is the book to read if you want to understand like what can happen when regulatory agencies fail to do their job, and when salespeople are willing to do absolutely anything to make sales. It is infuriating and so well written. This book is like over 500 pages, but I flew through it, and I look forward to reading other things by Patrick Radden Keefe. I know he has a book about the Troubles in Ireland, and I know nothing about that topic, so I do look forward to reading his book. I think it's called Say Nothing, very soon. The best nonfiction book that I read in 2025 was For the Love of Men by Liz Plank. This book is about toxic masculinity. But whereas most discussions of toxic masculinity focus on its impact on women, which is, of course, horrible, Liz Plank talks about how toxic masculinity harms men. And it talks extensively about how men's mental health is impacted negatively by these unrealistic standards placed on men. And attempts at bringing back masculinity are only reinforcing and making worse these problems. I am currently pregnant with a boy, and I am glad that I read this book because it makes me notice when toxic masculinity is on display. Of course, there's discussions about social media and how social media promotes this. One of the parts that really struck me was when she talks about how toxic masculinity makes it so that men don't go to the doctor, and partially explains why men have a lower life expectancy than women. And I've seen this in my husband's side of the family. There is a certain generation of men who never went to the doctor because it was seen as showing weakness. It also helped me appreciate the ways in which my father did not exhibit many of these characteristics. I'm sure he didn't completely escape it, but I'm grateful that I grew up in a family where there weren't gender specific roles, or like this idea of like, if you're a man, you're going to man up and like not show emotions or whatever. So I would definitely recommend it to anybody. I really would recommend this to men. And unfortunately, I think books like this often, if they are read principally by women. But I do think that if you are a progressive man who cares about how gender expectations harm all people, you definitely should read For the Love of Men. All right, so those are the 5 best fiction and 3 best nonfiction books I read in 2025. Let me know what your favorites were or if you've read any of these books. I will be making my next video about some of my goals on this channel in 2026. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.